from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I am very pleased to welcome you back to our series that we are doing on Journey Through Time, visits to 5 historical cities. Today we're very pleased to travel to New York City, and we're going to be there from the period of about 1830 up until the present time. This series has been such a pleasure to bring to you, to look back in history and to recognize and appreciate some very, very important characters and issues in our past. Today on our program, for our visit to New York City, we have 3 very famous guests. First of all is Mark Twain, who lived from 1835 until 1910. Of course, his real name was Samuel Clemens. As you well know, he was a great American writer and humorist, and that his writings were much admired and continue to be so up to our present time. Our gentleman who is playing, and our scholar who is playing Mark Twain, is Dr. George Frein, who is a professor of religion and philosophy who recently retired from the University of North Dakota after many years of teaching and work there in a very prestigious way. In character, Mark Twain, welcome to the program. We've had you twice before, and we're glad to have you back, and in this case in the setting of New York City.
Thank you.
And next to him is our second famous character in history, is Dorothy Parker. She lived from 1893 until 1967. She too was known and is appreciated as an American critic, a poet, a short story writer. She also was very involved with scripting Hollywood films and also a writer of Broadway plays. This famous character is played by Susan Jarvis King, who is an assistant professor of English at Tulsa Community College in Oklahoma. Mrs. Parker, welcome to the program. It's a joy to have you here.
I wish I could say it was great to be here.
Yes, I know, Mrs. Parker, that sometimes you don't seem to be real happy, but we will continue with that later. And our third guest today is Will Rogers, who lived from 1879 until 1935. He was an American humorist and actor, famous for his witty and homespun commentaries, often known as the Great American Cowboy. He too was a writer, and among many, many other talents he had, and he is played today by Dr. Douglas F. Watson, who is a professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University. Mr. Will Rogers, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Thanks, Tony. It's good to be back in New York.
Yes, well, we're glad you're here. And as always, we have 2 panelists who are visiting and travel to New York City with us. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney back in the state of Idaho. And next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development back in the state of Idaho at North Idaho College. And we shall ask Janelle Burke to commence today's questioning. But before we do, one footnote is I do want to thank the Idaho Humanities Council, who's brought these 3 distinguished people to our program and to a performance at North Idaho College. And with that, Janelle will commence the questioning.
My first question is going to be for you, Mr. Twain. You were known as a great humorist. Did you develop that, or was it something that came naturally to you?
Well, I guess I did develop it because it came natural to me. I think I inherited it from my mother. She had to have a good sense of humor to raise me. I was a difficult child, but I think on the whole, she enjoyed it. I think she even enjoyed the time that I ran away from Missouri. As a lad of 17, I ran away here to New York, and I wrote her, and she said that she might be surprised to be getting a letter from me from New York, but she shouldn't be disturbed, because after all, she remembered that all the people in Hannibal, Missouri said to their children, "Now, children, you do like Mrs. Clemens' son," her favorite son, not Orion or Henry, but Sam, "and you grow up to be like him." I knew that only humor could tease her out of her worry about my running away. But then, another great development is that you need to make a living. And when I was out west, I needed to make a living and discovered that humor was my strong suit. It's nothing to be proud of, but it is my strong suit. And I worked at it, worked hard at it. Good humor doesn't come easily.
How about you, Mr. Rogers? Did it come naturally to you, or was it something that you developed?
Well, it started early, because I was sort of the class cut-up when I was in school. And I was in a lot of schools for a while. After I had my first lessons in oratory, I took up kidding my classmates. But after I left school, I tried the cowboy for a while. And that ended up taking me to South America and South Africa. And that's where I discovered that, well, it was sort of fun to entertain people. Of course, I wasn't saying anything at the time. I was just twirling my lasso, working for Texas Jack in a show in Durban. But after I came back to the United States, I worked for Zach Mulhall. And, well, we were in St. Louis and New York City. And eventually, I got involved in vaudeville, again, mostly doing roping tricks. I would travel around with a horse and a friend of mine, and I would rope them, and they would go across the stage from time to time. It wasn't a great act, I guess, but it got us a little bit of income. Anyway, I was getting involved in show business, you see, and finally, well, my papa had wanted me to come back home and run the ranch. I said, no, I'm just an old country boy in a big city, but I'm eating pretty regular, and I think it's because I've stayed an old country boy. But I still wasn't saying much, and I was pretty shy in front of the audiences. The truth is, I've never met an audience yet that didn't fill me with just absolute trepidation. But after I got married, and that was the star roping performance of my life when I roped Betty, and she said, Will, when you're doing your act, you're just silent up there, but you spend all of your time reading the papers. So why don't you talk about what you've read? Make some comments. And I did occasionally, and I got some laughs. Well, after that happens to you, you kind of want more and more. And so now I find that there are a lot of people that refer to me as a humorist. I don't think that's what I set out to be, but if it brings pleasure to people, well, I'm satisfied.
Well, Mrs. Parker, what's your reaction to this? You have developed in quite a different way.
Yes, I have. I might say, Mr. Twain, I too ran away from home. However, no one noticed. And I might say, Mr. Rogers, that I was fired from the Blessed Sacrament Convent School because I insisted as a child that Immaculate Conception was spontaneous combustion. I was not invited back there, but I did learn a great deal while I was there. I learned one thing that I think has stayed with me through my whole life, and that is this, and perhaps you, dear lady, could use this in your life as well. If you spit on a pencil eraser, it will erase ink. I hope that is most helpful to you.
Thank you.
But I do think that my view of life is much different, perhaps, from Mr. Rogers. I know it's very different from Mr. Rogers and Mr. Twain as well, to some degree. But perhaps I was affected when I was a very small girl, and I remember I had a horrible aunt. She was a horrible woman then, and she is horrible today. And it was snowing, and we were in her lovely brownstone in New York, and we were looking out the window. And there were some men out in the street who were shoveling snow. And I remember that my aunt said, now, isn't it nice that it's snowing so all those men can have work? And I knew that it wasn't nice. And I knew that my aunt wasn't a very nice woman. And I think that is the first time I recognized social injustice.
Steve Sheen.
I'm going to be bold here and attempt a serious line of questioning, knowing that things don't always turn out the way you intend them to. But I thought I would pose a question to the group, and that is that you're all famous as satirists, and that is that a type of humor that you adopted almost as an academic choice, just a question of style, or is it something that you think you're your personalities were particularly well suited to?
Well, I never made very many academic choices. No, sir. I've always just tried to tell the truth. A lot of my humor is humor about politics. You know, you don't have to work very hard to say funny things about politics. Well, all I have to do is go down to Washington and drop into the old joke factory and see what the boys is doing. And then all I have to do is report the facts. Because those guys can do more funny things without thinking than I can ever dream up. I think all humor has an element of truth in it, you know. And then if you exaggerate it, well, so much the better. I don't know if that's satire or not. I suppose that there are some who worry about that sort of thing.
I think I can answer the question for you, Mr. Rogers. I think you are not a satirist. I don't think we have any satirists in this century. I think all satire took place in those other centuries. They're the big boys.
Okay, well, that's fine. I don't feel like I need the label.
Well, you don't have it. But if I'd been called a satirist, there'd be no living with me.
Well, that would be changed.
Yes, it would.
Mr. Twain?
Well, satire, or irony, is a kind of lie, you know. And long ago, I discovered that every time I try to tell the truth, that somebody thinks I'm lying. And every time I lie, somebody takes it for the truth. So I have a plan that when I want to tell the truth, I lie. And humor and satire fit in with that. And that's the difference between my fiction and other people's fiction. Everybody knows that my fiction is true.
And if I may, since we've already touched on the subject of government briefly, I would invite you to comment a little further on that topic of interest.
Will's right about the Congress. I never met such small-minded people in my life in the territorial legislature out in Nevada, nor in the national legislature. I once worked, though, for a United States Senator, Senator Nye. Nevada is his private secretary. And he asked me to write letters to his constituents, which I did. One day he came in a high dudgeon, and he said, "Did you write that letter to the people out at Baldwin's Ranch that wanted a post office?" And I said, "Yes, I did." I was relieved because I thought maybe I'd forgotten it. And he said, "Well, I'm going to read it to you for your humiliation. What the mischief do you people out at Baldwin's Ranch want with a post office? You couldn't do anything with a letter if it came to you. And if it had money in it, it wouldn't get out, beyond Baldwin's Ranch. So what you need out there," my letter said, "is a nice, substantial jail. I will see to it." And I signed his name to it. So he said, "You must leave immediately." Well, I took this as a subtle hint that my writing wasn't up to his standards, and so I quit before he could fire me. And I never will be a secretary to a senator again. You can't please that kind of people.
You got to forgive the congressmen, you know. I mean, they're really just children that never grew up. But part of the problem goes back to what Mr. Twain said a minute ago. They have these plans. And after they come to Washington and take a seat, well, they're not good for any honest work again. They just pursue the plans that they've got. And well, very few of them work. Even though they may be good in theory, they don't follow them through. Now, it's true that a lot of congressmen, their plan is just to vote for every bill that has an appropriation attached to it. But in the past few years, when we've had some hardship, like out in the West with the farmers, they've tried to provide some relief by way of plans. Somebody had a plan that they'd plow under part of the cotton. Well, Brazil found out where we'd plowed it under, and they come and dug it up. Now they've got more cotton than we did. Somebody else had a plan to teach hogs birth control, and it got to be a habit with them. Somebody out in the West said, the price of wheat is too low and there's too much wheat, so we'll plow up every third acre of wheat. And they did. And then the wind came along, blowed out the other two. So, the farmer comes out looking for the relief that Congress was going to give him, and he looks out at the farm that he spent all of his life trying to cultivate. It's up in the air. So plans just don't work. And my plan is don't plan. If anybody comes to Washington, senator, congressman, or even a man of great ability, if he has a plan, you just send him to Russia. Because that's the home of plans. Of course, that's where there's starvation, too, because you just can't digest the plan.
And if I can, just to finish
Mrs.
up,
Parker,
I didn't know whether you wanted to comment on government or your criticism is a little better known for its literary bent, whichever you'd prefer.
Perhaps so, but I have made one comment on government which I might share with you, and that was when someone informed me that President Calvin Coolidge had died, I said, "How can you tell?" That is the extent of my observation on government.
Thank you.
Earlier in a performance that I had the privilege of moderating today, we had a discussion between the three of you on a resolution, and that resolution was basically is that the affirmative, that humor is the best way to deal with even serious issues in life and to cope with life. And Mr. Twain and Mr. Rogers took the affirmative, yes, that is, and I know, Mrs. Parker, that you disagree with the resolution. So let's start with you, and would you tell our other distinguished guests why you think that is not the best way to approach life?
Well, the problem with my poetry is that everybody thinks it's funny, and that makes me sick and unhappy. I don't want to be classed as a humorist. It makes me feel guilty. I've never read a good, tough, quotable female humorist, and I never was one myself. I couldn't do it. Everybody wants to call me a smart cracker, and that makes me sick and unhappy. There's a hell of a distance between wisecracking and wit. Wit has truth in it. Wisecracking's just calisthenics with words. Anyway, I'm not a wit, but just a hard-working woman who writes for a living and who hates writing more than anything else in the world.
And what else would you say to Mr. Twain and Mr. Rogers about their glorification of humor and their use of it?
Mr. Rogers thinks that if one uses humor to make a person laugh about a serious subject, it would make the person feel better. And I think that it will always make the person feel worse, which of course is not a bad thing. It's all right to make people feel worse, I think.
What would you say to Mr. Twain?
I would say to Mr. Twain that he needs to write more poetry. I think that would be a good occupation for
You have never read my poetry, Dottie.
I don't have to read it to know what it's like.
Well, it is what you think it is. That's why I don't write it. But humor is mankind's greatest blessing. The minute it puts in an appearance, all our troubles vanish and our spirit is refreshed.
How do you explain me then, sir?
Well, I don't know. It's a puzzle.
It is a puzzle
It is a
because
puzzle.
I'm not
but
refreshed.
I think the best humor is really humor that is unconscious. The comic story. It usually starts out by the fellow saying, "Have you heard the story about the soldier with the broken leg?" And it's the funniest thing I ever heard of. And then he goes on and tells it till he gets to the punchline, and then he repeats the punchline 4 or 5 times. It usually takes a minute or so to tell a comic story, and then it isn't worth telling after all. But a true humorous story is told with a straight face, and the teller betrays no hint that he understands that there's anything funny about it or that it has a punch to it at all. And this story, the same story perhaps that the comic story was about the soldier with the broken leg or whatever, but it takes 40 minutes to tell. And the narrator wanders all around. And your humor has that wonderful quality.
Well, I
about
do
it
think
that-
you're right, though, that it's difficult to intend to be humorous. And I think that was one of the big problems with the members of the Algonquin Round Table.
They
is
tried.
They tried very hard to be humorous, and we spent lunch every day. It was exhausting. 5 days a week. Well, obviously, we got together even on Saturdays and Sundays, and you were expected to be witty. I was invited to people's homes for the entire weekend for no other purpose than to make them all laugh. It was exhausting. And I remember coming back into New York City on Monday morning. I had a hangover that could have been put in the Smithsonian under glass, but that wasn't good enough for them. They wanted to be entertained. You see that? That's the problem with rich people. They are so boring, and they are unable to entertain themselves, and so they expect us to do it.
Well, you can't entertain on, no, you can't be humorous on a schedule. I wrote for just a year for the Galaxy magazine, a humorous column, every month. Oh, it was just agony. And at the end of that contract, this is the best contract I ever had in my life up to that time. I gave it up. I just couldn't be funny.
Mr. Rogers, you've listened to the other two. How do you deal with humor and your response to what they've said?
I'm just very puzzled by this whole conversation, to be just real honest about it, because it seems to me that the death of humor comes when the humorist begins to take himself so seriously. All of these distinctions between satire and wit and humor, I don't see that they serve much purpose. And, well, Mr. Twain, as much as I respect you, I don't understand why a fellow can't laugh at his own stories. I've always enjoyed the stories that I told just about as much as the audience. And I told them for myself as much as for them. So, you know, I just try to see what goes on around me, and I talk about it. And if other people find it enjoyable, well, so much the better.
Janelle Perk.
I have a very quick question for Will Rogers. You're a cowboy.
Well, I started out as a cowboy.
But you certainly don't look like a cowboy today.
Well, I've been to California. No, my last attempt at serious ranching was when I came back to Claremore, well, actually out close to Oologah, where our family ranch was. But that was in 1900. And I stayed there for about a year and a half, ran the ranch for my dad. But then I got wanderlust and took off for South America. By the time I got back, I'd kind of been bitten by the entertainment bug. But I haven't given up the idea of ranching. And when I'm not on the movie set, but in California, there are a lot of afternoons when Betty and I get in old LaSalle and we go out driving. We're going to save up our money and buy us a ranch and raise some cattle.
My husband, Alan Campbell, and I bought a farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and my dream has always been to retire there and raise chicks. I think it might be easier than writing for money. That could be a crop. Have you ever considered that, Mr. Rogers?
Well, no, I can't say I have. Most of my ranching was with longhorn cows.
Well, perhaps you should think again.
And Mr. Twain, were you from an agricultural family as well?
Well, it was the curse of my life. My father died. There's nothing worse than inheriting prospective wealth. He died owning thousands of acres in Tennessee. And his dying instruction was, don't sell that until the price goes up. So we expected to get rich any day. And the price never went up on that land, ever, until I swore off it and told my brother Orion, you do something with that land, but don't ever talk to me about it. It was an awful burden to bear. No, I'm not really from an agricultural background, though I did once edit an agricultural newspaper. And I described, how you should harvest the carrots to get the best tops, that you can possibly get.
We need to move on to Steve Sheen.
And I was fired, just like that, right out of the blue. And I was outraged. I was insulted. I'd been in the newspaper business 14 years before I got that job, and I had never heard of a newspaper editorialist ever having to know anything to
Wayne,
go
thank
to
you
work.
very much. Steve,
I want to follow up just a little bit on what Janelle was talking about, and I'll start with Ms. Parker. You said you hate writing, and I assume your comment about raising checks was a piece of humor. What would you truly like to do?
I would like to raise checks.
That was the honest answer, and I
think
just
that's a
didn't.
very honest
Mr. Twain
answer.
was right. You can't always tell the difference between these things. Well, now, Mr. Twain, I know that you had another career aspiration besides writing.
I did. But that was my vocation. I spent hours and hours and hours every day. I thought I might be a preacher to begin with, but I discovered I lacked the stock in trade, namely religion. So I wouldn't have made a good preacher. I did make a good pilot on the Mississippi, but the Civil War put an end to that. I was not about to stand in a pilot house, all glass and gingerbread, with the Union on one side and the Confederacy on the other, both firing at me to get a victory. So I pulled out of that and joined a band of Confederate irregulars for 2 weeks and learned more about retreating than the man who invented it. So I went to the captain and told him my war was a disappointment, and I withdrew, and so gave the Union cause a chance.
And Mr. Rogers, would you truly have rather been a cowboy than a comedian?
Well, I don't think of myself as a comedian.
Performer?
But I suppose performing's been awful good to me, I've got to say. And it's been good to my family because of that. But you see, part of the joy that I've had is that, well, money's not good for much unless you can do something with it. And part of what I've been able to do is to buy a little piece of land out in California. And I've got a place where I can go out in the evenings and rope calves. So I'm still kind of involved in some
Do
of
a
that.
little of both. And if I can go
I'm
back,
sorry, we're
not
out
enough
of time.
time.
But the good news that we have, Steve Shink, is that we will have our guests back next week, and we'll visit New York City again with Mark Twain, Will Rogers, and Dorothy Parker. And our viewers, I know, are looking forward to it. On 30 minutes, we just get started, as you see, with these distinguished guests that we have. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the series Journey Through Time, Visits to 5 Historical Cities. And I would like to invite you to be back with us when we will continue this discussion of humor, and except for Mrs. Parker, who believes that we're dealing with something else other than humor, we will proceed with that, and we will ask all 3 guests to continue to discuss certain issues, and we'll have certain terms for them, and I hope you will join us at that time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I am most pleased to welcome you back to our series entitled Journey Through Time, Visits to 5 Historical Cities. For our regular viewers, you know, for a number of weeks, in fact, this is week number 12, we bring you this series, and this will be our last program in that series, and next week we'll move to a different topic. But it's been a great pleasure bringing you this particular special series, and I want to thank the Idaho Humanities Council in particular for the guests we have today and several programs that we've done, and we wish to thank over the whole series the North Idaho College Foundation and the Associated Student Government of North Idaho College for money that they provided for the symposium at our college in which we got those guests to come on this program. Our very famous guests today, as we visit New York City one more time as we end this series, are first of all Mark Twain, who certainly is known throughout modern time as an American writer and humorist who lived from 1835 to 1910, and he is portrayed today by Dr. George Frein, a professor of religion and philosophy who recently retired from the University of North Dakota. Mr. Twain, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We're very pleased also to have on the program today the historical character Dorothy Parker, who lived from 1893 to 1967. She was an American critic, poet, and short story writer, and she is portrayed today by Susan Jarvis King, who's an assistant professor of English at Tulsa Community College in Oklahoma. Mrs. Parker, welcome back to the program from last week. And our third guest is the well-known Will Rogers, who lived from 1879 to 1935 and was an American humorist and actor, and he is portrayed by Dr. Douglas F. Watson, who is a professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University. Mr. Rogers, welcome back from the program last week.
Thanks. It's always nice to be asked back.
Well, we're so fortunate all three of you could come back, and I welcome to New York City our regular panel, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho out west, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at that institution, North Idaho College in northern Idaho. We shall ask Janelle to commence today's questioning.
Each of the three of you famous people lived during a time when there were events that were significant, events that changed the lives of people all over the country. And that was one of the things that you often talked or wrote about. And starting with you, Mark Twain, you lived during the time of the Civil War, for example, in the United States. What kind of an effect did that have upon your humor? Can you be humorous about those kinds of serious events?
No, I didn't make much humor. I made one attempt at humor, and I won't try it here because it was a total failure. It ended up in a duel, and I had to leave Nevada Territory. Just about the time the war began, I headed out west where there wasn't any war, and so I escaped from that. But I lived then most of my writing career during the Gilded Age. I named it the Gilded Age, and it was an age that you could write about with humor because it was a time when I blame Jay Gould for that. People had always wanted money, but he taught them to fall down and worship it. And when people try so hard to make money, they sometimes make jokes of themselves in the process, and nobody made a bigger joke of himself than I did. And so that was a time for good humor. No, you're right, the Civil War was not, and I didn't attempt to make humor on the basis of the war.
What about you, Will Rogers? You lived during the Depression, for example, and was that something that you commented on? Did people see humor in that? What was really a tragedy for many families?
Yes, ma'am, it was a tragedy. There were more than 7 million people in this country who wanted to work, who couldn't get jobs. And
especially from Oklahoma,
well,
the Dust Bowl.
It was a bad time to be in Oklahoma, but it was a bad time to be in lots of parts of the country. Economics had sort of collapsed around people, and they didn't know quite how to respond. Always, a lot of people had lost a lot of money in the stock market. Best advice I ever heard about the stock market came from President Coolidge. You know, he said, take your savings and put it in some good stock and wait until it goes up. And if it don't go up, don't buy it. Well, I myself never did put any money in the market, but I watched some of my friends lose almost everything they had. And there were a lot of people who just never had much to put in. The weather made it a hard time for farmers, and I think it was made a whole lot worse because we took too seriously the advice of the bankers and the economists.
And what was that advice?
Well, they
As you saw
said
it.
that if, you know, that person ought to borrow money at what they called very little interest at low rates. Now, if you believe that, you ought to ask yourself why it is that the banker's house is always the biggest one in town. No, it's a sucker game. But an economist, you know, is a fella who can tell you, if he knows what the condition, or he can tell you what's going to happen under any given set of conditions. and his guess is likely to be just about as good as anybody else's.
What about you, Dorothy? You lived during some of those times, too, that were very trying. You must have been a young woman at that time.
I think one of the most difficult times was the 1920s. You know, Gertrude Stein did us a lot of harm, and she called us a lost generation. And I think that got around to certain people, and they all said, we're lost. And it brought us, I think, a sense of the change in our lives after World War I, and certainly a profound sense of irresponsibility. But remember, even though those people in the 20s seemed like flops, they weren't. Reckless as they were, drinkers as they were, they worked damn hard and all the time. Silly of me to blame it on dates, but so it happened to be. It was the 20s, so we had to be smarty. I wanted to be cute. That's the terrible thing. I should have had more sense.
Steve Sheen.
I'd like to finish up a line of questioning. I ran out of time in our last show, and I had posed to two of the panel members the question, what would you do if you weren't doing what you're doing now? And I wanted to get to Ms. Parker and ask her, especially since she said that as a writer she hates writing, which of the many kinds of writing you do, short stories and literary criticism and screenplays, etc., which of those many kinds of writing do you hate the least?
What I really wanted to be, and I'm glad you asked me that question, is I wanted to be a playwright. I can't tell you what it's like to go into the theater and hear your words being spoken. At opening night is a wonderful thing. And I think really I wrote a couple of plays that were very good, but Broadway being what it is, they did not succeed, and that was one of the great disappointments of my career. I think if I could choose an area that I would be successful in, it would be Broadway plays.
And I'm going to stay with you for just a moment and start a new line of questioning that I'll extend to the other two panelists. Of the things you have written or done as a professional, what work are you most proud of?
I think I am most proud of the work I did in Hollywood, not as a writer, but as a member of the board of directors of the Screenwriters Guild. We did a great deal to improve the situation of writers in Hollywood. And also my work as a member of the board and of the organizers of the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, and I think we have done fine and brave work.
Thank you. Mr. Twain, you've talked about your affection for being a riverboat pilot, and if you want to say that is the thing you've done you're most proud of, that's fine, but if you would also address that question to your writing as well, I would appreciate it.
Well, I'm very proud of the personal recollections of Joan of Arc. I think that's maybe my favorite work, although I deeply appreciate my own work in The Prince and the Pauper. I know my daughter, Susie, like she said, that's Father's best work. But she liked it because, as I did, because there wasn't any humor. At least I think that's why I liked it. You know, we're always proud of things that don't come easily to us.
And Mr. Rogers, you've been a screen star, a radio personality, a stage performer. What are you most proud of?
Well, I've said a couple of times that I think the thing that's wrong with most people, that's wrong with all of us in common, is selfishness. So I guess what I'm most proud of are those things that I've done that demonstrated the least amount of selfishness. Now, I've been an awful lucky fellow, made a lot of money, and I've been listened to and read by a lot of Americans. But the best things I've done, I think, are to take advantage of that attention and try to distribute some of the little bit of money that can be broken loose in this country from the hands that are trying so hard to hoard it and spread it around a little bit. Particularly, a couple of the tours that we've done in the Mississippi Valley area in 27 after the floods, and when we went down to Nicaragua after the earthquake. You know, there's just as much money in this country as there ever was. It's just got into fewer hands. And even people like Huey Long have a pretty good idea that probably we ought to spread it around a little bit more. So when I've been able to help do that, well, that's what's made me happiest.
Thank you.
I have a couple of words or phrases I want to use, and because all of you address those somehow in your work, and then just get you just respond to it. Mrs. Parker, I will start with you, because a lot of your poems and a lot of the work that you've done and a lot of talk you did earlier today in our programs is the relationship between men and women. Mm-hmm. That's my first phrase that I want you to react to.
Well, I must say that it has not been a happy phrase for me. I have found men very difficult, and I might read one of my poems to you. I've been hoping for an opportunity to do that.
I noticed that you like doing
and
that.
I'm glad that you finally gave me that chance.
Well, thank you.
But this is a poem that I wrote in Paris in about 1926, entitled Men. They hail you as their morning star because you are the way you are. If you return the sentiment, they try to make you different. And once they have you safe and sound, they want to change you all around. Your moods and ways they put a curse on. They make of you another person. They cannot let you go your gait. They influence and educate. They'd alter all that they admired. They make me sick. They make me tired.
Thank you. I guess that sums up your position. Mr. Rogers, you'd like to respond to that?
Well, I've worked around a lot of women, and they're beautiful. A lot of them are. In Mr. Ziegfeld's Follies, because he didn't hire any girls that didn't fit his idea of beauty. It was a good one. But I've never quite wanted to possess a woman, as Ms. Parker suggests men want to do. It seems to me that in that regard, a woman is a lot like an elephant. It's enjoyable to watch, but I wouldn't want to have to feed it and keep up with it. For me, the true woman in my life is Betty, my wife. And ever since I pulled off the roping trick that got her, pretty much everything in my life's just gone pretty well.
Mr. Twain.
Well, I think that the human intellect cannot estimate what we owe to women. Why, they give us good advice, and lots of it. They soothe our brows. They bear our children, ours as a general rule. And where would we be without women? Where would the people of the world be without women? Well, they'd be scarce. They'd be almighty scarce. And no civilization can count itself perfect until there is exact equality between men and women.
My next word that I want to have all of you react to, and I appreciate how precise you are. Again, you've discussed that and written about it, the concept of death. Mr. Twain, we'll start with you.
Well, death is a great blessing. I think we ought to die younger, lead to greater happiness.
I've been trying, Mr.
Have you?
Twain.
Yes.
Yes, I have.
Well, people rejoice after birth and weep and mourn at the death. And why? Because they're not the person involved. That's why.
I remember when Mr. Benchley was drinking rather a lot once, and someone said to him, Mr. Benchley, drinking is a slow death. And he said, well, that's all right. I'm in no hurry.
Ms. Parker, anything else you want to say on this issue of death?
Well, of course, I have a poem to read.
Well, I kind of thought you might.
Yes. Well, it's called Resume, and I think it will explain itself. Razors pain you. Rivers are damp. Acid stains you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful. Nooses give. Gas smells awful. You might as well live.
Well, thank you. And Will Rogers.
Well, death is going to come to us all. I mean, it just makes sense that it's going to happen, doesn't it? But the point is to try to live your life as fully as you can while you have it. And so that's what I've set out to do. My philosophy is to live my life so that when I lose, I'm still ahead. I'm going to ride in the airplanes, and I'm going to ride my horses and play polo even if what happens mostly is that I get hit in the mouth or fall off on my head. But it seems to me that a person ought to live his life as fully as he can. And then when death comes, well, it comes. And I expect I'll probably go in an airplane crash. I mean, you can't get any publicity anymore dying in an automobile accident. And when it comes, when I die, I hope that the epitaph, or whatever they call those things that they carve on your gravestones, I hope mine will say that I joked about every prominent man of my time, but I never met a man I didn't like. I'm real proud of that. I can hardly wait to die in order to have it carved. And if you come around after I die, you may see me out there sitting at a little bit of a distance, just sitting there reading it.
Speaking of automobiles and airplanes, I believe you have an opinion about the intelligence of those who drive both automobiles and planes.
Well, to my friends who tell me not to ride in the airplanes, I ask them, think about the intelligence of the people who fly in the airplanes and compare that to the intelligence of the people that are driving the cars. And you see which one you would rather be in. I tell you, it's not a choice for me. And cars are everywhere. I mean, it's the greatest disaster of our country right now. Mr. Ford had such a great idea to make these things available to everybody. And now, well, what this country needs as much as anything else is a place to park. And I suppose we're probably going to be the first country to ever go to the poorhouse in an automobile.
Janelle Bird.
The automobile is a wonderful machine. It is so comfortable to ride in. I never was a rider of horses the way you are, but I bought a Mexican plug one time. And as soon as I got on that animal, he put all 4 feet together and lowered his back and then shot me up in there. And when I came down, he wasn't there. That was a dangerous animal.
Yeah, well, that happens sometimes with automobiles. I asked Mr. Ford, who's a friend of mine, not so long ago. I said, he'd been cutting the price of his automobile so that everybody could have one. I said, Henry, how cheap could you finally sell these cars? He said, well, I could give the cars away, so long as I could control the sale of the parts, because they'll shake off enough boats in a year to pay for themselves, and then after the first year, everything's just pure profit. They're not much smoother than that plug that you have.
Mrs. Parker, do you want to respond to this?
I don't drive.
Do you ride?
I do ride taxi cabs in New York City.
I mean horses.
Oh, no.
You're a wise woman.
I think so.
Janelle Bird.
Well, my next question has to do with religion. I believe that all 3 of you also had opinions on that subject. And so let's start again, first in time, with Mr. Twain.
Well, I'm not shy about expressing my opinions, but I was on one occasion. I went to a dinner party, and the conversation got very heated about heaven and hell. I didn't say a word. Finally, the hostess said, Mr. Clemens, you've been quiet all evening. I'm sure you have an opinion. And I say, well, I do, but you must hold me excused. I have not taken part in the conversation for a purpose. You see, I have friends in both places. We should not blame all the troubles in the world on human nature. The Creator bears some responsibility for it too. Adam didn't eat the apple because he wanted it. He ate it because it was forbidden. And he just acted according to his nature. He didn't make himself. He didn't ask to be made the way he is. So there is some unfairness in the Lord's administration of His creation, I've always thought.
What about you, Mr. Will Rogers?
Well, I try to be pretty broad-minded about most things, and I'm especially broad-minded about religion. But I know that there are a lot of people who spend time worrying and debating about things like the virgin birth and the second coming and all of that. It seems to me that if we would spend less time worrying about how the Savior got here and what he did and what he would do and all of that, if we'd start talking about that and start imitating him, we'd probably be a lot better off. I mean, he had a number of plans for us, and he gave them to us, and he hoped we'd follow them. And he said, love your neighbor as yourself. But I bet there's not two people in your block that's speaking to each other. We just don't seem to follow the imitation or the example that was given to us, and that's where men and religion kind of get mixed up, because we try to control things too much.
Dorothy, from a woman's perspective, what was your outlook on religion?
Well, I don't know if I would really represent women. I can only represent myself. But I was born of a Jewish father and a Scottish mother. And I think that has always been difficult for me. In fact, a great many people have asked me why I didn't write an autobiography. And of course, I would never do such a thing. If you knew anything about my childhood, you wouldn't even sit in the same room with me. But I did have an idea that I would like to write my autobiography simply so I could title it Mongrel.
Steve Sheen.
I think it tells you something about people if you know what their pet peeve is. So I'd like to address that question to each of you. We'll start with Mr. Twain. Is there something that in particular bothers you?
I don't know something in particular. It's just the whole race that is a nuisance. The damned human race. People make the biggest fools of themselves that you can imagine. But I wouldn't narrow it down. I'd rather enjoy the whole range of it.
Ms. Parker?
I could be very specific about that. My pet peeve, I'm quite sure, is men.
Mr. Rogers?
Those folks that live lives that are pretentious, those fellows that think they're big men, but really aren't. Deep down, they're just ordinary fellows, but they pretend to be bigger than they are. I think a fellow ought to be what he is.
And I'm going to stay with you if I can and start another series of questions for the whole group. You're all very well, are very successful people, very well known in our time as well as in your own. What particular training, or did you have any particular training to prepare for your career?
Well, I guess I'd have to talk about which career it was. My career as a lassoist, that one began when I was just about 2 with Dan Walker, who worked for my papa. Taught me how to toss the lariat just a little bit. Everything else I pretty much picked up as I went along. School, no, I can't say school did very much for me.
Not much formal education, Ms. Parker?
Well, I don't usually tell people this, but my education ended when I was 14. I did not graduate from high school, but by God, I read. And I think really that is how I learned enough to do as well as I have, although I would not consider myself a success.
Mr. Clemens?
Well, I ended my mother ended my formal education earlier than that. The summer after my father died, there was an epidemic of measles in the village, and for a while there, every day they buried a child. Well, the parents were terrified, and they imprisoned their children in the house, and nothing could take place but prayers and hymn singing and Bible reading. And life under those circumstances was not worth having. And I determined to escape and get the measles and get it over with one way or another. So I got out and snuck in the bedroom of a boy in my neighborhood who had the measles, was very sick with it, and got in bed with him. And they found me there, and I went back again. And I got very sick with the measles. For a while there, they were really worried about me, but then I got better. Disappointed everybody. But my mother ended my school career there and put me in firmer hands, sent me off to learn to be apprenticed to a typesetter. So I think it's very important that you not let your education, your schooling, interfere with your education. And I've never ceased being educated, but I ceased a long time ago getting to school.
Well, perhaps a sentence that I once uttered at the Algonquin Roundtable might sum up this idea of education and culture. When I was asked to use in a sentence the word horticulture, and I said, you may lead a horticulture, but you can't make her think. I think that says something about education. I'm not sure what.
I guess on that note, we'll have to bring the program to conclusion. I noticed that we're almost out of time, and on behalf of our staff and our panel, I would like to thank these three famous people, Mark Twain, Dorothy Parker, and Will Rogers, for bringing us two programs that we have found very, very interesting and lots of fun to present to you. And I know you've been in character throughout the whole program. I wish we had time on the program to let you come out of character to talk about what you do. You're all three scholars, and you have been so generous with your time, and we are very, very grateful about that. Ladies and gentlemen, with this program, we bring to a close the series that has been titled Journey Through Time, Visit to 5 Historical Cities. We just had such a good time bringing you these 12 programs, and we again thank the Idaho Humanities Council for their work in helping us do this. And I'd like to say to all of you that next week we will continue our programs by moving to a different subject. It's not very often we bring you such a long series, but once a year when we have our symposium, we do that, and we have a great enjoyment of bringing people from around the United States, and while here at our campus, to share them with a larger audience by having them on this program. And the other issues we do, we also enjoy very much. Again, I want to thank you for watching this series, and I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time when we shall discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.